Don't talk about your deceased loved one, because that's just going to bring you more pain. Or stop crying because you're not letting your loved one's spirit rest. Please, every day in consultation, in the people who come to us, in the people we interact with who are going through the grieving process, we often hear that their family members, friends, and acquaintances use expressions like these two. Sometimes with the intention of calming, of providing a bit of comfort, or saying something friendly that encourages loved ones to feel differently, to not be sad. And this has a logical origin, because being in front of someone who is sad and going through great pain is tough, it is hard, and if we're not ready to embrace someone else's sadness, then the first loving reaction will always be to try to prevent them from being sad. Well, it's tough. And if we're not equipped and not prepared to embrace someone else's sadness, then the initial reaction out of love and care will always be to try to prevent them from being sad, force them out of sadness, from sadness. And it turns out that in that effort, in that intention to prevent people from being sad, what we do is create rejection. And on top of sadness, we generate a bit of anger. We create frustration. Because I haven't met the first person who stops being sad just because someone tells them they shouldn't be sad. In that intention to prevent people from being sad, what we do is create rejection, and on top of sadness, we generate a bit of anger and frustration. Because I haven't met the first person who stops being sad just because someone tells them they shouldn't be sad. Among other things, because if sadness arrives, it's because sadness has knocked on our door and believes it should be there to accompany a process, an event that brings sadness. Sadness. Just like joy, all emotions are healthy. They are part of our richness, of our humanity. They have specific functions. One of the important functions of sadness is to invite us to reflection, to remembrance, but also to seek help. Many times when we're sad, we want someone to hug us. We want someone to listen to us. We want to share our emotions with others. Sadness often leads to nostalgia, and blah, 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 or to moments of great creativity. A lot of reflection. Many of the most important decisions I see people making daily in their grieving process are made during moments where sadness was the main character. And so there was a sadness, sometimes in solitude, sometimes in company, and the possibility of expressing to someone that I'm sad is also the opportunity to welcome that sadness. And so sadness has a very particular and healing effect. The other thing is that sadness, one of the most beautiful functions of sadness is that it gives meaning to joy. I always ask the people we support, what would happen if in life we only felt joy? We only had difficult moments. At first, one might think that it's like an ideal world, but in practice, when we only have difficult moments, well, what happens is that when we only have happy moments, well, what usually happens is that happiness starts to lose its meaning. It's the only thing we have, and then it becomes part of our routine and loses its depth. On the other hand, when life is colored by all the emotions, we have moments of happiness, but we also have moments of sadness. We have moments of calm, but we have moments of euphoria, but we have moments of anger. All that range of emotions produces in us a sense of depth. When I'm talking about the feeling of depth, it's that feeling of meaning. Because, of course, we had moments of sadness, and then suddenly a happy moment comes, a joyful memory, and since we were sad before, we have the opportunity to compare, and the comparison gives it depth. When we paint, there are two very important colors in painting, black and white. Black gives depth. We can have that sense of depth in the painting when we use shadows, and white gives it brightness because it's the way we add light to the paintings. So those two elements give meaning. That's why I say that those two emotions can add depth to our lives. So sadness is really important. Now, can we feel sad? Can we talk about our loved one, and while talking about them, can we cry remembering them? Well, if we can't do it right when we miss them, right when they pass, then when can we? Of course, we need to talk about our loved one. Of course, we need to remember them. Of course, we can feel sad when remembering, when it becomes evident that they are no longer with us. But of course, that is what grief is about. Grief is not about escaping. Grieving is about facing it. My dad shared a metaphor about facing emotions. Normally, when people have very strong emotions, the first reaction is to try to run away. I stay busy to avoid it. I keep myself busy so I don't think about it. And what we end up doing is that we keep thinking about it. When we have a deep sadness, we can't run away from it. It is what it is that's going to make me get to work. Well, sadness is with us. Sadness can't be pushed away or calmed down or locked up in a room. It's like we're protecting it. And the metaphor is really interesting because he was talking about of quicksand. For example, if we fall into mud, meaning if we're experiencing normal and not overwhelming emotions, then it's like falling into a muddy pit. And the logical thing to do is to move forward to get out of the mud. But if that emotion is exacerbated, if it's very intense, it's like we're submerged in quicksand. So, the way out of a quicksand is very different from the way out of a quagmire. If we're in quicksand and we try to lift one foot, what we end up doing is throwing off our balance and putting more weight on one leg. And this makes our bodies sink even more. So the best thing to do, put more weight on one leg, and this makes the body sink even more. So, the most convenient thing. When we're in quicksand, the best thing to do is to stay still. To stay still, to avoid sinking further, and the second step is to ask for help. Or look for a branch, or find something that can support us so we can push ourselves up without adding more weight. Exactly what happens with exacerbated emotions. What we do with them is to receive them, accept them, get to know them, and talk about them. Sadness is talked about, sadness is shared, sadness is embraced, sadness is received. That's why it's healthier if you're accompanying a person. If someone is sad, be careful. You need to make a distinction between sadness and depression. If you're supporting someone who's sad, the invitation is the same. It's to listen to them, to let them be sad, to allow them to talk about their loved one, and in that dialogue, if they cry, to let them cry. That's the best kind of support. No one ever stopped being sad. Sad because someone told them to stop being sad. And if on top of that you say, don't talk about your loved one because it makes you sad, then you're just going to increase the feeling of anxiety and deepen that sadness. Because what I want is to remember my loved one. In fact, the grieving process is about developing the ability to remember my loved one without it hurting. The feeling of anxiety, you're going to deepen that sadness because what I want is to remember my loved one. In fact, the grieving process is about developing the ability to remember my loved one without it hurting. So that every time I remember, I don't have to cry. But to get to that state, where I can remember my loved one differently, what I have to do first is remembering it with pain, remembering it with sadness, talking about it. We used to say in our process to start the cassette. Today we would say to start the playlist. Right. Telling our story so that, by telling our story and having voices that listen to us, we gain different perspectives. So one of the most harmful myths about grief is that if I talk about my loved one, I'm going to be sadder. And therefore, what I should do is avoid talking about my loved one, avoid remembering him. No, grief is about being able to remember him. And that process, then, is achieved through the encounter with sadness, the encounter with pain, the encounter with anger, the encounter with emotions, just as they come. Thank you very much for listening to us, and stay tuned for little capsules about the myths. We are in a series of myths and beliefs around grief among which we do Reflection. Please let us know your thoughts. At the end of the video, below this video, there's a comment section. What are some of the most common myths you've been told? What myths have hurt you the most in your process? And please allow us to respond to your comments. We send you a big hug and see you in the next video. Thank you. We're in the next video. Thank you.